Hi, everyone. This week we're going to look at the early medieval period, looking at internal and external challenges to Christianity and what we call the rise of Christendom. So, um, we already talked a little bit about Constantine, his role in the Nicene Council, the fact that he allowed Christianity to be tolerated, and he and then later in the fourth century, the edicts of Theodosius, and finally the edict of Constantinople in 392 that banned paganism. We talked a little bit, certainly, about the role of religion in society, and even in our society in the United States, which doesn't allow the establishment of any religion or the favoring of any religion. Um, but how should we as Christians be involved in the political and social life of our society, which is an important question to consider today? Um, there was a rise of political power in Christianity during this time period, and there was a sociological shift from Christianity among the disenfranchised, the powerless, or the poor to Christianity among those in power. And that began to change Christianity significantly in a way that led to many Christians being disillusioned with the Christianity they saw around them at that time, because the power tended to corrupt the Christianity of that time. Um, there was a division of power, as I mentioned last week, between five bishops. But then the Bishop of Rome became the most powerful politically because that was where the Roman Empire was centered. Of course, that began to change a little bit later as Constantinople became more and more powerful as well, especially after the fall of Rome in the 5th century. Um, Gregory the Great, however, because of the fall of Rome, the Roman bishop became actually even more powerful, holding both spiritual and political power in the West. So Gregory the Great was mentioned as one of the most influential bishops of what's called the early medieval era. He he became the Bishop of Rome. He brought the Celtic Church of England under the umbrella of Catholic Christianity. He oversaw leadership over the churches of Gaul, Spain, Britain, Africa, and Italy. Even though he never proclaimed himself Pope, he was the first one nicknamed with the title of Papas, which means Pope or Father, Holy Father. Um, he When the Bishop of Constantinople tried to call himself the Universal Bishop, Gregory resisted and eventually won the favor of the Eastern Emperor. He gained wealth and power for the church. He developed Gregorian cants. Um, he obviously had significant influence on the early medieval church, but most importantly for us, I encourage you to read that section in Stanley Burgess's account of Gregory the Great and his emphasis upon the Holy Spirit and the role of the gifts of the Holy Spirit and the role of miracles in the church, which he all emphasized and practiced. Um, but during the early medieval era we also saw the rise of Celtic Christianity, started by Patrick of Ireland. Of course, we all celebrate St. Patrick's Day, but a lot of society celebrates it, sadly, outside of its historical roots, with Patrick being the apostle of Ireland. He was known to be a worker of miracles. He prayed for the sick, and they were miraculously healed. He imparted spiritual gifts to others. He was a very spiritual, charismatic Christian leader, and his disciples went out throughout Europe and began to re evangelize Europe and make it strong. One of his direct followers, Columba, evangelized Scotland. Columbanus, after it, re evangelized Central Europe, especially the French and Lombard kingdoms. And there's a famous author named Thomas Cahill who wrote a book called How the Irish Saved Civilization. Excellent book that looks at how Patrick and his followers really helped save Western civilization, but even the essence of Christianity itself. Um, an external challenge in the early medieval period occurred with the rise of Islam. In 610, Muhammad began to proclaim monotheism in the Arabian Peninsula. In 630, he amassed enough followers to take control of Mecca, and it spread throughout the Middle East, including Spain and some of Asia to the east. But after two defeats by the Christians in the East and the West, Islam centered on developing an Arab civilization centered in Baghdad. It's interesting to note, though, how did Islam, um, it spread over many areas that largely had been previously Christian. Some of these areas were largely influenced by Gnostic Christianity, interestingly, but Islam spread over these areas rapidly and solidified itself to this day in the Middle East. But in the early medieval period, we also see the rise of the Holy Roman Empire, which became an important part of Christian history at that time, both politically and spiritually. It felt it was necessary to protect Orthodox Christianity in the West. The Roman bishops sought allies, and the Frankish rulers, beginning with Clovis, were the most promising. Clovis, among his descendants, uh, uh, was Charlemagne the Great, who really was the founder of what we now call the Holy Roman Empire. He was declared emperor of the Romans and baptized and crowned and blessed by the Pope at that time. He expanded the kingdom to Germany and Italy, but a power struggle erupted after that weakened the Holy Roman Empire. It existed really until Napoleon took over and really largely took over and ended the reign of the Holy Roman Emperor in 1806. But because of the Holy Roman Empire and because of the rise of what we call political Christianity in Europe in the early medieval period, we have to look at the question of Christendom or Christian nationalism. Does it still exist in modern society today? I don't think it really exists in a formal way in the United States, but it certainly exists in other countries, somewhat in Europe and other places in the world today. Um, but it is reflected in our society in different ways. We have to consider how is Christendom, or the desire for I guess you could say a Christian political reign over society, how is it reflected in society today? It was reflected in the medieval period because many kings of that time period in Europe developed what we call the divine right of kings as a theology that they developed. They believed that they were apostolically or genetically descended from Christ himself somehow. It's more popular, that idea is more popularly portrayed in Dan Brown's book and movie, The Da Vinci Code, that somehow these European kings believed they were actually descendants of Christ himself. Um, but that portrayal is not historically accurate. It was only politically expedient. Um, so again, Dan Brown's portrayal is merely fiction. It's not history. But it was politically expedient during the medieval era for kings to develop this idea. Another idea that began to develop at this time was the celibacy of the priesthood. Um, it was really an ideology that developed partly out of the corruption of of the church as it began to be more and more powerful. And we're running out of time, so we're going to have to go into a second session on this. So we'll see you in a few minutes.